if we think about the average American today, the average American, for many, many decades at this point, has been eating, the so-called Western diet, which just means it's calorie dense and it's freely available. We're essentially never, the average American eating the average American diet is essentially never fasting. So we always have glucose in the system to use as energy. We're never going into ketosis if we're like the average person. What is the connection there, if anything, to chronic disease in general, but neurodegenerative disease in particular, things like Parkinson's, things like Alzheimer's? You were getting into that earlier, but is there a connection between never being in intermittent metabolic switching, never being in ketosis, and developing these neurodegenerative diseases later in life?
Yeah, well, I can kind of divide this up into animal studies and human studies.
Mm-hmm.
So in humans, epidemiological studies, pretty convincing now that people with obesity and insulin resistance are at increased risk for Alzheimer's and age-related cognitive impairment.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they're also at bigger risk for stroke because of the cardiovascular effects, atherosclerosis, and they're in a state of chronic inflammation. They're in a state where their cells are not able to deal with free radicals very well. That can actually increase risk for cancer. So that's one thing that's very clear. This Western type eating pattern, being in a, never getting into a ketogenic state, it's a big risk factor for most cancers. All the major cancers, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and in the case, so Parkinson's, the data are a little less clear, but we do see in our animal models that intermittent fasting protects the dopamine producing neurons.
I see. Just a quick question on the cancer side. Is it fair to, it seems commonsensical to make that connection to me. It seems very natural to think, okay, if we're always in feeding mode, if we're always supplying our body with all this energy, well, cancer is just unrestricted growth. So if we're always in growth mode, we're going to be more likely to push things in the cancer direction. Is that essentially what you just said there?
And also there's two-stage model for cancer development that's kind of generally accepted, is that step one is there has to be some damage to genes, some mutation. That mutation is in a gene that's involved in controlling cell growth and survival. And so that's step one. And then step two is that there has to be a mechanism to keep the cells in a growth mode. So I guess step one is mutation and then go into this continuous growth mode. If you deprive cancer cells of glucose in a dish, in a culture dish, they can be very easily, it will inhibit their growth. They can be easily killed by radiation or chemotherapy.
I see.
But if you give them ketones, in case of most cancers, not all, they're still susceptible to being killed by the radiation.
Yeah. So the cancer cells, maybe even more so than non-cancer cells, really want to use glucose.
They want to use glucose.
So if you don't put, even if the cancer is there, like you've created the cancer through mutation. If it doesn't have the fuel to power that hyper growth, it's much more easily susceptible to being taken out either by the immune system or by radiation or some kind of medical treatment.
Yeah, and it's been shown clearly in animals. You take cancer cells and you put them into the animal under the skin, and a tumor will form. Or in case of like glioblastoma, brain cancer, you can put glioblastoma cells in the brain and a tumor will form, and the intermittent fasting and daily calorie restriction will slow the growth of the cancers. And there's many human clinical trials ongoing now,
Mm-hmm.
dozens actually.
Mm-hmm. Where they're actually using fasting as part
Yeah,
of the treatment
yeah,
itself.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't like so? I've rarely heard this talked about outside of conversations like this with people like you. I've seen people with cancer. I've talked to many people who know people who've had cancer themselves. I've never encountered someone out in the wild who's had cancer and survived it, or someone who I've known who's had cancer. I've never encountered a situation where their physicians were telling them anything about diet or recommending fasting or anything like that. Is that just not part of the normal medical culture today, or is the evidence not quite there? Or why
Yeah,
is
it's so in our Western medicine, the United States is probably the worst healthcare system around in a major industrialized country. It's all profit driven throughout, unfortunately. And so you've got big pharma making drugs. You've got the fast food industry making things that elevate our glucose and probably do other bad things to us. And then you've got congressmen being lobbied by these industries. And then the healthcare system itself it's geared, there's no prevention in mind, or disease risk reduction. Your insurance won't cover your whatever, going to a gym every day
mm-hmm.
or you know, whatever. For example, in people in lower socioeconomic status, particularly in inner cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can't even get vegetables are very high cost. They're relatively expensive, and so on. So there's no insurance that will, help them have
Yeah,
a more healthy. And
the affordable and available foods are exactly the foods that will cause chronic disease.
yeah, that's right. And there's no mechanism. There's a lot of industries pushing that in a way. The fast food industry directly, the pharmaceutical kind of indirectly, in that they won't make any money if people don't get sick,
Mm-hmm.
right? They make money by someone getting a cancer, being diagnosed with whatever, diabetes or cardiovascular disease,
Yeah,
atherosclerosis.
yeah. They do the best when there's an extended treatment that requires many interventions over time.
Right, right. So education is, what you're doing right now. I mean, it seems like we're kind of fighting a insurmountable battle, but if people can be educated and motivated and kind of encouraged that to change it. One part of this too now is it's transgenerational, right? So kids that they grow up, if their parents, for whatever reason, don't exercise and eat mostly junk food, those kids are highly likely to adopt the same patterns,
Yep.
right? And what you learn during those formative years often sets the stage for the rest of your life. So there has to be some mechanism put in place to address that, you know.
Mm-hmm. Um, switching gears a little bit, or at least on the theme of, staying on the theme of, thinking about prevention, and the maintenance of health. We've talked about intermittent fasting and fasting in general. We've talked about exercise, how if you stress the body in the right way, in the right pattern, it can actually have adaptive effects. I think the technical term for this is hormesis, and you've written about this. But on this general subject of hormesis and challenging the body in an intermittent fashion, another type of challenge that I think is really interesting, and you're definitely seeing this in certain parts of the culture, has to do with things like temperature and hypoxic stress. So I want to talk about temperature for a minute and how that affects things like just physiology in general, but things like mitochondrial health and metabolism. A lot of people are getting really into things like ice baths, going into the cold on purpose. They're getting into things like saunas, going into the heat on purpose. Is this a type of stressor that's analogous to things like exercise that will have actually potentially adaptive beneficial effects?
The short answer is yes. Uh, the benefits of heat or cold exposure, intermittent heat and cold exposure relative to exercise and fasting, I think are not as great, but there are benefits. We've got a sauna, infrared sauna, and I usually do it every other day or so for like 45, 50 minutes, get up to like 130, 140 degrees. So you sweat.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll start with heat. So there's these proteins called heat shock proteins.
Mm-hmm.
They're very well known, huge literature on this, and they were discovered. It's pretty simple. People they they had cultured cells and essentially put them in. They'd have one incubator at like normal body temperature,
Yeah.
and then another incubator at say would be the equivalent of like 105 degrees Fahrenheit body temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not outside, that's the actual body temperature. And then they looked at changes in gene expression. And they found a certain set of genes, heat shock genes, that are responsive to this. They call it a shock, heat shock,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
heat stress. And this happens pretty quickly within tens of minutes of changing temperatures. These heat shock proteins go up. And then the function of these heat shock proteins is pretty interesting. It prevents the formation and accumulation of misfolded proteins. In Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, one clear problem is that the neurons are accumulating
Misfolded proteins.
misfolded proteins. And so that's pretty interesting. We never did that. I don't think those experiments have been done of like taking a mouse model of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's and then, doing what kind of the equivalent of a human, get once a day or whatever, elevate the outdoor temperature so that the
Yeah, a daily mouse sauna.
right, and then do that long term and see. But it would be interesting.
Mhm. Well, the prediction, I guess, the prediction would be that if you were to do this before the development of disease, you would
Yeah,
either prevent it or push it out in time.
yes, that's right. Now,
And then, okay, yeah. What about cold?
cold's interesting too. Right. So I'll talk about some proteins called mitochondrial uncoupling proteins, or UCPs. Uh, I'll try to streamline this as well as I can. So rats and mice, they don't, well, some animals don't shiver in the cold. They will actually generate heat. And specifically, there are these cells called brown fat cells
Mm-hmm.
that are producing the heat when the temperature goes down outside a lot. And well, essentially when the body temperature starts to go down.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening there is when the body temperature starts to go down, the genes that produce proteins called uncoupling proteins are turned on. And the uncoupling protein, what it does is it causes the mitochondria to produce heat instead of ATP, or produce heat in addition to some ATP.
Okay.
Okay, so these brown fat cells, which these rodents and some other animals have a lot of, humans don't have much of these brown fat cells. Um, Interestingly, we found that in neurons, I kind of did the opposite experiment I talked about, putting cultured cells in a hot. We took we took cultured neurons from the brain of rats, and we put them in the refrigerator. All right, and then, or we had controls that we didn't put in the refrigerator, and then we took them out of the refrigerator, and then I can't remember how long, we incubated them for a while longer. Then we looked at gene expression, and we found that uncoupling protein was increased.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but then we found that using a drug that activates uncoupling protein in the absence of any change in temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we take temperature out of the equation. If we activate the uncoupling protein directly, it protects neurons against a variety of types of stress. In fact, there's a company now that's doing clinical trials of this drug. It's actually a very well-known drug in chemistry, and it's called 2,4-dinitrophenol, or DNP. And people actually used to take this to lose weight,
Mm-hmm.
because it causes uncoupling. So they'll be essentially, the calories will be used for generating heat, and their body temperature goes up, they lose weight.
Hmm.
But a few of these people had the bright idea, okay, I'm taking this amount of DNP and I'm losing whatever, 2 pounds a week. Hey, I'll take a lot more and I'll lose, in 2 weeks I can lose 40
4 pounds.
And
Yeah.
they died.
Because they just overheated?
Yeah, essentially yeah.